So on with the presentation. So welcome to Teams Fest. My name is Magnus. I currently work as a solution architect for a European tech company called Atea, where I spend most of my time helping public sector customers and large corporates to do Microsoft Teams the right way. Before joining Atea, I worked for a Norwegian municipality, where among other things, I was in charge of moving 6,000 or 7,000 students and staff to the cloud with Microsoft 365. I'm also a Microsoft Teams MVP. I have a blog called teams.rocks, and I run a user group on Facebook with about 5,000 educators and IT pros called Microsoft Teams for Education. You are, of course, more than welcome to join us using the QR code in the bottom right corner. So the title of today's presentation is Creating a Safe Learning Environment. And privacy is a fundamental right, and something that needs to be taken seriously. At the same time, we need to consider the extraordinary situation we are currently facing and balance this against other needs like disease control and performing education. So this is from last night, or actually yesterday morning. UNESCO tells us that 184 countries experience a countrywide school closure. Actually, the number is now 185, and more than 1.5 billion, or about 90% of all learners, are affected. So now we need to create a safe learning environment, not just at schools, but where the learning actually happens, which for millions of students will be on the Microsoft Teams platform. So just to be clear, don't feel bad if you rushed into using Teams for remote learning. Do your best to make sure kids get their education. That's what's most important right now. And consider any changes to your environment when things, go back to normal, or when you have the time. Okay, so 1 second. So Microsoft Teams is the hub for teamwork and bring together everything a team needs, right? Chat and conversations, meetings and video conferencing, PSTN calling for those who use that, content collaboration with the power of Office 365 apps, and of course the ability to create and integrate apps and workflows that your business or organization relies on. And you can do this anywhere, anytime, on any device. Anytime, anywhere, on any device. It's not ideal from a traditional security point of view, is it? Thankfully, Microsoft has a lot of security built into the platform. I'd say they are in a unique position, actually. If you just have a look at these numbers, Microsoft they have about 3,500 engineers working security, and their infrastructure handle 630 billion authentications each month and analyze more than 470 billion emails. So if you combine that with telemetry from all these devices and activity signals from within the platform, and you get an enormous data set. And they use that to detect anomalies and prevent intruders. And most of this is built in and on by default, but we also have a range of tools available for us that need to be activated and or configured, which is something we'll discuss throughout this session. But before diving into all the tech, A key responsibility for teachers in terms of privacy is to make sure that students are well aware of privacy issues, how to navigate the internet in a secure fashion, and provide clear guidance on what's okay and what's not unlike in the classroom, right? And it's up to school owners or school authorities to provide policies and guidelines on how to use apps and services like Microsoft Teams. This picture is from my living room / home office / classroom earlier this week. And you can see that my 11-year-old's teacher is here explaining to the class how to behave using video and chat, and talking about things like that video is not a requirement, but if they choose to share their video, they should blur their background to ensure the privacy of others who might be in the room. As a parent, I received a message telling me that schools had opened up for chat and video as a pedagogical tool, and in order to make sure that they can properly communicate with students in these difficult times. I was asked to pay extra attention, talk to my kids about usage guidelines, that content shared primarily should be related to the subject or the class, that it's important not to make noise and disturb others, and that is of course zero tolerance for any bullying or exclusion. From the teacher perspective, they are team owners and can configure settings like member permissions within their class team. That could be whether students can create channels or add applications, if they can use things like memes and emojis. And we've also got the option within the members tab in the team settings to mute one or more student if they start making noise in the conversation. It's good to know that this is a team setting. It will not mute students from either chat or other teams. It's just for that individual class team. On a platform level, from the admin perspective, one of the tools or features, if you will, in terms of privacy is scoped search. And in order to utilize scoped search, we need Exchange address book policies configured. Basically, we subdivide our directory and then we assign users a policy which is a subset of available address lists. And a common scenario for this is education. Schools in or students in school A maybe shouldn't be searchable by students in school B or by employees that are not associated with the school. In a municipality, that could be those working in the administration, in healthcare, working with the roads, with gardening, the harbor, things like that. They most likely have no business communicating with our kids using Teams. So with these address book policies in place, and these are things we create in Exchange, most often using PowerShell. But with these in place, we can tell Microsoft Teams to kind of respect these boundaries. In the Teams Admin Center, we go to org-wide settings and Teams settings, and we enable scope directory search using an Exchange address book policy. There are a few limitations. With hybrid Exchange, this feature isn't supported for the on-prem mailboxes. On-prem users will only be able to discover members of Teams therein. Also, users will not be able to search or discover Teams when scoped search is enabled. They will only actually see Teams that they are a member of or invited to. And this is what it looks like when scope search is enabled, when you try to search for someone outside of the scope. The biggest issue with this is, however, the fact that it only limits search, not communication and collaboration. So if you know someone's user principal name, which should be the same as your email address, you will be able to initiate a message or a call. It's also currently only available in Teams and in SharePoint. So if it's a requirement in your organization that certain groups of people don't interact using Teams, you might need to get those E5 or A5 licenses or an add-on called Advanced Compliance. But Teams is the hub for teamwork. Why should we keep people from communicating? Well, in certain industries, there are laws prohibiting such communication. And information barriers was originally built for the finance industry, where the Finance Industry Regulatory Authority, FINRA, require companies to control potential conflicts of interest. In this example, investment bankers might suggest to consumer clients which stocks to buy, while on the other side, financial advisors might help large corporates with things like mergers and acquisitions. Now you can imagine if Google is planning to acquire Slack, if that information leaks from the financial advisors and investment bankers advise clients to buy or sell Slack, that would be considered insider trading, right? So in the Security and Compliance Center, we'll create two organizational segments. This example uses investment bankers and financial advisors, but let's pretend that we're talking about students on one side and employees outside of the education department on the other. You can see on the right that we have, or we can use user attributes from Azure AD so that segments are dynamic, like, for example, a department. Yeah. Or we can also base these on security group membership. When we create such a policy specifying whether, we then create such a policy specifying whether communication and collaboration should be allowed or blocked. There are a few requirements. We must enable audit logging in the platform, and you'll actually, for information barriers to work, need to remove any Exchange address book policies, but scoped directory search must still be enabled. So how does this work? Well, Microsoft has built a conditional access authorization layer on top of some of their services that will actually evaluate any information barriers at the time of access. So with one-to-one chat, you will not be able to search for or initiate a chat with a person in a blocked segment. And in this example, if a teacher starts a group chat with someone outside of the education department, you can see in the drawing in the upper left corner that teachers and staff, or teachers and school staff, they have no security boundaries present. They can connect with students and they can connect with employees outside of schools. But there is an information barrier between the students and the employees outside of schools. So here, the teachers could invite maybe first someone outside the education department and then accidentally add a student. The person who was added last and then violating the IB policy will automatically be kicked out. As for meetings, you could obviously invite users in conflicting segments. You could send out an email invitation with everyone in your company or everyone in your organization, and it will allow the first user to join just fine. But when the second user try to join a call, effectively breaking that IB policy, they will get a message like the one you see on screen. Information barriers is available in Teams, and SharePoint support is expected within a few months. I think actually there's also a private preview or a preview for SharePoint document libraries connected to the team, but yeah, well, the support is limited. And services like Stream or Planner, they have no knowledge of anything called information barriers. So if you need a watertight solution, you might need to look into actually disable those, which is unfortunate. Okay, so let's shift gears and dive just a little bit deeper. Microsoft best practice is to let everyone create groups and thereby teams. While I'm sure that works fine at Microsoft, other types of organizations have other issues and other requirements. Like the education sector, I've got customers with tens of thousands of students in their tenants. And you can just imagine kids in the age of 7 through 12 creating teams and inviting all their friends. I mean, that would work fine for the most part, but you're likely to also get teams with inappropriate names as well as conversations. And Microsoft's response is that, oh, you can create a list of blocked words. And I'm thinking like that's ever going to stop kids. I know I have no way of keeping up with their ever-changing vocabulary, acronyms, and clever misspelling. So I think there's also a need from an IT perspective and a school owner perspective to stay in control. And a large tenant in Norway is one with maybe 30,000 users. I have a friend in the UK who runs what they call a mega tenant for the entire education sector in her country. You can just imagine having thousands of schools and millions of students in one single tenant and allowing for group creation. Who thinks that's a good idea? Well, since I can't see your hands, I'm going to assume that it's no one. So let's limit group creation. And we do that by connecting to Azure AD using PowerShell. Last time I did this, I had to use the Azure AD preview PowerShell module, and we'll run a script to specify that group creation only should be allowed for users within a specific security group. Outside of that, certain admin roles will also still be able to create those groups. And one thing to be aware of is that each member of this group will need to be licensed with either Azure AD Premium or Azure AD Basic EDU. It's going to work just fine without those licenses, but you run the risk of one day receiving an invoice from Microsoft for being under licensed. A different approach could be to make a request form for Teams, where we could use a service account that's a member of the group creation security group. I prefer to use Microsoft Forms, mostly because it's super quick and easy. It's user-friendly and it looks great. But if you need more flexibility, you can use a Power App or a SharePoint page, or it's up to you. So let's add a few questions, one for team type. In this example, I've got a project team, collaboration team, etc. It could be a class team, a PLC team, a staff team. And the user would then need to specify a name and a description and press submit. And we're going to match the team type against a template later on. First, we create a SharePoint list to save the input from the request. We have a few columns, one for title, team type and description, as well as one called requester or owner to store the actual user object of the user requesting the team. And that's nice when using Microsoft Forms, because we can just pull those data from the form, since you would have to be logged on to the platform. In order to get the results into the SharePoint list, we use Power Automate and a template called Record Form Responses in SharePoint. I'm not going into all the details here. I have a blog series on Teams.rocks called Take Control of Your Microsoft Teams Environment that will run by this step by step. Okay, so let's have a look. I'll choose, I go to the form, choose project team, give it a name, followed by a description, and then click submit. And in a few seconds, you'll see that you get a new item in the SharePoint list on the right. So far, so good. We could then have an approval flow in Power Automate that triggers whenever a new item is added to that SharePoint list. So in this example, I'm collecting some information about the user requesting the team, as well as his or her manager for the approval. We could obviously just send the approval to someone else like IT, or just provision the team without any approval. In this example, we send the approval request as an adaptive card inside a Teams chat message. We could also send it via email, which will look like this. If the manager does not approve, he or she will choose reject, type a short explanation to the user, and click submit. We then got a condition action in Power Automate, and since the manager rejected the request, we will notify the user and finally just update the SharePoint list with the rejection status. If the manager or IT or anyone chooses to approve, we will inform the user. We can also post a message into a Teams channel using the Flowbot so that IT stay informed on any new teams that are being created. At this point, we are ready to do the actual provisioning. There are a number of different ways to do that. We could do HTTP request to Microsoft Graph, either from Power Automate, using logic apps, or by triggering an Azure Automation Runbook. But since we have different templates in the request form, let's implement a switch action and a case for each item. So Microsoft Graph supports 3 ways of team creation. The first one that was available was Teamify Group. We then got Clone, and finally we had templates, which is still in beta, but the one I actually prefer to use. If we decide on cloning, though, we need to create our own team to use as a template. So just to create a team using the Teams client, give it a descriptive name, and configure any settings. And this is the HTTP post towards the clone endpoint. You can see in the yellow box, upper yellow box. And you can see that we also bring in the title and the description from the SharePoint list and specify what we would like to clone, like apps, tabs, channels, settings, and or members. Files are still not supported, unfortunately, but we have other ways of fixing just that. I also wanted to add a prefix to the mail nickname, but that was actually ignored. Instead it will remove any special characters from the display name and use that for mail nickname. Another issue with cloning is that the service account will be added as the owner. We also have ways to move around that, but it's easier to just choose a different approach. So Let's imagine that this is the HTTP post action in Azure Logic Apps. It could be Power Automate as well. It's going to look exactly the same. And we're using the beta endpoint up in number 1 there. And we can specify all team settings in JSON. In the yellow box, we request a couple of channels and a website tab. We can then configure all the team settings before we add a couple of applications on the right in the red box. And finally specify the owner of the team in the bottom right corner. And as you remember, our team's request form was really simple. We just had team type, name and description. But if we wanted more flexibility, we could have added a drop-down menu or yes or no radio buttons and just added those variables in here for a much more dynamic experience. We could choose yes or no to allow team mentions. We could say yes or no to allow jiffies, and those options could be made available for the requester of the team during the team's request process. Okay, so Microsoft has custom templates for education, healthcare, and retail. And what's special about those is that you get a fully configured team with channels, tabs, as well as some content. In education, when a teacher chooses to create a new team, they will see this experience, allowing them to use or to choose between either a class, a professional learning community, a staff team, or a regular team. Within the class team, you get the special assignments app. You get a read-only folder called course materials. You have a way for teachers to mute conversations for those noisy or overly creative students, like I mentioned, as well as the OneNote class notebook, fully structured with pre-made content, allowing teachers and students to get started in no time. And this is a simple example triggering an Azure automation runbook. You see we've got a few parameters in here that we pull from the request form. We have the team name, the description, and the owner. And some Norwegian text in there, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so, and this is the actual runbook. And you can see that we use the exact same logic here. We have an HTTP post to the Microsoft Graph. We could, of course, load the Microsoft Teams PowerShell module in here, but using Graph gives us much more flexibility. And the key part to notice is what I'm showing you here is it's a template data. And I specify here the template called education class. Okay, so I'll demo the request process in just a second, but I also wanted to share an even better way to control Teams provisioning in EDU. So we have something called School Data Sync, which is a free service in Office 365 for education, and it takes data about students, teachers, class rosters, and more from the student information system, and use those data to provision and license users. It also will create all those class teams, like one team for each course, and make sure students and teachers are synced in these at all times. And this is important because, well, in August, a customer of mine provisioned 7,000 teams, which is something you really don't want to do manually. Furthermore, if you provision 7,000 teams each August when school starts, you will get a lot of teams, right? So we need to control the full team lifecycle. So in July, School Data Sync archives all those 7,000 teams, which makes them read-only and adds a prefix to the name to separate to separate them from the current teams, and so that you have something to script against when students leave school in a few years. But it's important to keep them archived as long as students are in school, because they have a right to use this data when they come to their exams, right? And this works well in hybrid as well. School data sync will match the users and extend the Azure AD schema with some data that you can make use of actually in other services as well, like Intune. One example I share a lot is how you can use Graph to trigger autopilot reset and wipe all Windows devices belonging to 10th graders when they leave school. But that's way outside of scope of this session. So let's move further. If we get back to the request form, we had an example from retail. I'm sorry, I have the education example in this tenant, but I'll choose the retail store, so just the name and type in a description, and finally click submit. We will see that an item is to list in the down right. In this example, the manager will go into the chat and the adaptive card and choose approve. And we can see that there will be a notification in the Teams, in the approvals channel within the team on the left side. Okay, a few seconds. There we go. The Flowbot has notified us that there's a new team, and then the new team appears complete with channels and settings. And the whole thing takes about 30 seconds. So it's not bad, huh? And this was, of course, custom built for governance. So finally, let's have a look at what we can get out of the box. We could have enforced this naming policy, a naming policy using the request form, but there's also naming policies for groups that will let us add a prefix or suffix based on certain attributes or block words that might be offensive or may cause confusion. And we can use attributes from Azure AD to create those prefixes or suffixes or whatever. So let's move forward. We also need a way to manage those groups and teams we no longer need, especially for those teams not created using school data sync. Because in the request form, we had one option that was a project team, and it's kind of in the definition of a project that it's limited in time, right? So we can set up an expiration policy, specify the lifetime and a contact for any ownerless groups, and then we choose what groups should be covered by the policy. The group owner will be notified 30 days, then 15 days, and then 1 day before expiration, as long as there's no activity in any group workloads like Teams, SharePoint, as well as in Outlook. If there is activity, it will just prolong the lifetime. And then after all these warnings, the group with all the resources like the team will be soft deleted. Okay, so Teams is great for collaboration, but for confidential or sensitive data, it's maybe a little too open and available out of the box. So you might remember from the request form that we had a team tagged with internal, which means that we have no guests allowed. And this setting is applied on a group level. So we'll need to connect to Exchange Online and Azure AD using PowerShell in this example. And then we loop through all the groups marked as internal or any groups that we want to use in this example, and then apply the settings. When a user tries to add someone outside of the directory, they will simply, as you see in the lower part of this slide, not find a match. And we could obviously disable guest access as part of our provisioning process. But there's also a new set of features in preview called sensitivity labels. And what's great is that you can apply such labels to either content like documents or containers, like Teams. So if you apply a sensitivity label to a team, all the content of that team will be affected by the policies. You could say that we don't want guests in any of our class teams, so we apply a sensitivity label to each of those teams, denying guests. So let's say we have a label called class, and we choose to disable guest access and only allow access from managed devices. So only student devices managed by Intune, for example. And every team with that label and all data will be treated in the same way, so that IT can rest assured that the end users don't accidentally invite any externals into this team. So a bit over time. In summary, there are lots of tools, features, and control mechanisms within Microsoft 365, like scoped search, information barriers, sensitivity labels, and more, that you or your favorite global admin can implement to create the safest learning environment possible. But if you are an educator following this, I personally think that in this day and age, it's equally important to teach students about privacy and provide clear guidance on what's okay and what's not. I hope this was valuable to you and that you learned something new. And please don't forget to rate this session. That's it from me. Thank you.